a young man was riding his bike and he noticed there were plants that he had really seen before. And he went home to research and he found out they were prairie plants. So he started gathering seeds and moving them around and stuff like that. And another person saw him do it and started to help him, and they decided maybe this was supposed to be a prairie, and they started opening it up. A lot of this was done without any supervision or anything like that.
This young man was Stephen Packard, the founder of the North Branch Prairie Restoration Project. He's that radical and charismatic organizer who I mentioned at the end of last episode, whose political career had stalled out at the end of the Vietnam War movement. He was looking for an outlet for his skills and energy. The North Branch Prairie Project introduced me to the man recounting the genesis of the story of this operation. His name is John Thill, and he's advocated for and managed Lene Woods as a volunteer steward with the Cook County Forest Preserves for decades. I'm sitting in he and his wife Marion's backyard, but it's more like a sanctuary, a time capsule that allows you to immerse your senses in the native biodiversity that once existed before their village was developed just outside the city. They use it as a nursery for native plant seeds, a breeding ground for bees and monarch butterflies, and a safe haven for Midwestern birds you can hear filling the warm summer breeze with a quiet song as we chat. Lene Woods is part of a larger, continuous grouping of forest preserve sites known now as the North Branch Restoration Project. Early prairie restoration research and experimentation by the Preserve District's naturalists, among whom are Floyd Swink, Bob Betts, and Ray Schulenberg, had revitalized the landscape architect Dwight Perkins's vision of native grassland stewardship in Chicagoland, despite the overpowering favor of wooded areas from a cultural and legal framework. But it was really the engagement of amateur citizen volunteers under Stephen Packard's leadership, like John and Marion, that helped rescue these sites from the brink with the North Branch Prairie Restoration Project. Packard used his organizing skills built up by the anti-war movement to mobilize folks from a variety of backgrounds to revitalize grassland remnants that had essentially become repositories for trash and overrun by invasives. The group began formally in 1977, and Packard struggled to convince the Forest Preserve governing body, which had become notoriously corrupt and stagnant, to allow their amateur volunteers to experiment with pioneering restoration tactics. They assumed that the scrappy self-funded volunteers would pull a couple weeds, pick up some trash, and go away. But by 1993, the group included 5,000 volunteers working on more than 30,000 acres of land in the northern Chicago metro area. Packard, his volunteers, and even his mentors in ecological research faced considerable challenge in this emerging field of restoration ecology, which had no real playbook yet. How were they going to establish functioning prairie and savanna ecosystems when there were almost no remaining evidence of what healthy ones looked and operated like? Most of them had disappeared, along with their most sensitive species, very quickly during the agricultural development of the region, before anyone had the mind to study them. I asked John to recall the first time that he saw the site that they stewarded for 20 years, that now contains both open prairies and healthy densities of trees and wooded areas.
When I first saw the woods, they were thick. You couldn't see 10 feet into them. And I remember seeing a movie after that where cowboys and Indians, where the Indians were chasing the cowboys. And they were riding through these woods. And I thought to myself, only in Hollywood would the woods look like that. When then I realized that's the way the woods look when they're being taken care of, when they're not being overrun by buckthorn and honeysuckle and everything else like that. And so that was an awakening for me. Well, look what you got.
Well, I figure if I want some, I have to share.
So rephrase that question so Marion could answer.
So we were just talking about what the landscape looked like when you first saw Lene Woods.
Yeah, it's hard because we weren't knowledgeable then. And so we had learned from the other stewards, and so we came to know what buckthorn was, and we just knew there was a lot of it.
Buckthorn, one of the main enemies of the stewards in Chicago forest preserves, both in the early days and into the present. Without the culling influence of fire, this invasive had outcompeted almost all of the native diversity and filled the grassland openings between the anchoring savanna tree species. Without a healthy functioning ecosystem to study, Packard could not be afraid to experiment with these degraded buckhorn-infested sites. Like an ecological detective, he diligently scoured forgotten cemeteries, roadsides, and overgrown train tracks to identify species. He cross-examined different historical land use records to try to figure out what species had disappeared from these community structures entirely. Meanwhile, back at the Cook County Forest Preserve sites, his loyal North Branch volunteers worked diligently to clear the invasives from the area, reseeding the savanna and prairie sites with the precious remaining seeds from Packard's exploration. They worked and waited each season, hoping for the best. We discussed in the last episode that conservation rhetoric had exploded in cultural relevance at the turn of the century. This happened because of a surge in industrial development that changed the average citizen's relationship with the outdoors and led to a severe degradation and development of various ecosystems from sea to shining sea. By the 1960s, public relations from conservationist groups and governmental bodies had established a firm understanding in the public of what the wildland was and how it should be taken care of. The parks and preserve bodies of the U.S., both on a nationwide and county-specific scale, created a mythology of an untouched wilderness, ecosystems uninhabited by humans and unscarred by their handiwork. This founding myth is at the core ideas about conservation. Sierra Club editor-in-chief Jason Mark recently described this ethos, saying, quote, "Conservation drew lines on a map to keep out bulldozers and chainsaws," unquote. The Forest Preserve District in Cook County, of course, did not exist in a vacuum, and the management strategies of the staff and the neighbors of the preserves largely accepted this hands-off approach to coexistence with the remnant sites. The North Branchers' scrappy and very hands-on approach to land management drew ire from established conservation academics. The book Miracle Under the Oaks by William K. Stevens recounts the scathing peer review of a paper that Packard had hoped to publish outlining the species he speculated to appear in the structure of a healthy savanna based off of his exploration in the Chicagoland area. Stevens quotes Packard as saying he was strongly urged to stop working on the restoration of sites and, quote, "let someone else do it who will do it right." It was not the right thing to do to read lists of associates in a book and experiment with restoration and try to figure things out, unquote. The researcher responsible for the critique, quote, "insisted that what we should do was go to the best savannas there are and make species lists, and that should be our standard. They were patting me on the head saying, quote, 'You're not a scientist, you should leave this to other people,' unquote." But Packard sensed folly in this approach, arguing that the remaining savannas were so degraded that they would offer an incomplete insight into the species necessary for true restoration. Unswayed by the discouragement of academics, the North Branchers continued their boots-on-the-ground research and experimentation with restoration efforts. In Miracle Under the Oaks, Stevens describes the efforts saying, "Restoration is gardening in a sense, and also agriculture, but with a big difference. Its purpose is not to shape nature into one's aesthetic taste or to make a living, but rather to enable nature to take its course. It seeks not to control or modify natural processes, but free them. It places humans not above the rest of nature, but in it, and not just as an admirer, but as a participant." The North Branch was not alone in its restlessness with the cautious approach of the scientific establishment in the early century ideas regarding conservation. Traditional hands-off conservation was still focused on trying to find pristine examples of nature and turn them into zoos that failed to recognize their existence as dynamic, ever-changing ecosystems, as well as their interconnectedness with surrounding habitats that had been destroyed and deemed not as worthy. Despite their efforts, conservationists across the country were losing the battle to biological isolation of protected habitats, wildfire suppression, and the eradication of predators that allowed herbivore populations to explode and literally eat away at the very structures of the ecosystems they were trying to conserve. The so-called hands-off approach created results that were just as much a product of human interference as the more obvious villain of development and degradation. If humans had caused this problem, New Minds and Restoration believed that it was going to take humans to fix it. By the later half of the 20th century, more and more were moving from the defensive to the offensive, and their projects were in line with the efforts of the North Branchers. Degraded remnants that would need something far beyond preservation of existing health, but going beyond to bring back habitat from the brink. As crazy as Packard sounded before to traditional conservationists, he was about to sound far crazier as he took on his biggest challenge yet, bringing fire back to the landscape. This podcast was researched and created by me, Lou Bean, with music by Chicago musician Hauntus. For references used in this episode and further reading, check out Cook County Forest Preserve's online archives, as well as Miracle Under the Oaks by William K. Stevens, and Stephen Packard's own blog, Woods and Prairie. Thank you to John and Marion Till for their time in interviewing with me and their years of stewardship with the North Branch Restoration Project.